We're talking about gold and technology. Should be fun. A couple of specific things. Both of the talks have PowerPoint, so get yourself into PowerPoint comprehension mode, and we'll have Nathaniel talking about the Gold Reserve Act of 1934.
Now for some historicism. It's a little George our last panel. I'm here today to talk about the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. I want to particularly focus on a discussion of a specific question, and that is, what makes a good policy? Because I think there's an element of there is how to act, there is what to do, and then there's also a question of how to execute it. And as an Arkansas Razorback fan, I assure you execution matters just as much as intent. With that said, when we think of the New Deal, we think of it as kind of an arbitrary moment of executive action, and it has become a litmus test the first 100 days by which so many administrations are judged. And I think to some degree, our understanding of it is defined by these quotes from Walter Lippmann, the famous journalist. Walter Lippmann described Franklin D. Roosevelt before his inauguration as a pleasant man who, without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president. After the culmination of Roosevelt's presidency, when asked about those comments, Lippmann reiterated and stood by him. It was an accurate description of his 1932 campaign, and the fact is that the New Deal was wholly improvised after Roosevelt was elected. These comments have basically defined New Deal literature. To some degree, scholars pick whether or not Roosevelt had a plan ahead of time, whether or not Roosevelt improvised everything, whether or not Roosevelt was a genius, or whether or not Roosevelt was a hack. I think this has produced a perfidious myth, though, that executive technocratic genius can solve most of the nation's problems rapidly if only the will and talent are applied to the problem. But most of the policies of the New Deal failed or counteracted one another. In fact, most of the economic recovery between 1933 and 1942 is largely attributed to one policy, and that is the growth of the money supply in that window, which had little to do with the Federal Reserve's own policy in this matter. So who is responsible for this expansion of the monetary policy? The New Deal, in my mind, should be considered not a judgment of executive genius or not, but rather a series of policies and an evaluation of which policies worked and how they were formed. So with that said, I want to direct our attention not to the man on the left that has received so much, but to the man on the right. While many people have commented that Herbert Hoover was in the car with Roosevelt early in the morning, in the afternoon, it was Senate Majority Leader Joseph Taylor Robinson of Arkansas who was sitting in the car with Roosevelt. Now, to explain why I think this matters is Robinson is often a forgotten figure in our understanding of the New Deal. And this is part of a myth of the fact that Congress was viewed as either a rubber stamp for Roosevelt given vast Democratic majorities, or the view that Southern senators were largely an obstructionist to New Deal policies, a break that Roosevelt had to manage. I want to push back against both of these because, as we'll see here, there were long-running systemic problems that plagued specific Southern states that those congressmen sought to resolve those challenges. So, with that said, I'm going to skim through quickly some things. There's a long-running historiography of the New Deal starting in 1960, the relationship between monetary policy and the New Deal starting in 1963 with Friedman and Schwartz. This is developed further in the 90s by Romer and Eichengreen. And then in the aftermath of the Great Recession, a new wave of scholarship particularly interested in Roosevelt's policy after Ben Bernanke attributed Friedman's analysis to his policy kind of provoked this again. In all of this, though, the focus remains on the Federal Reserve and the White House. In effect, it remains on expertise. What I want to suggest, though, is that actually much of our understanding of the New Deal's monetary policy should instead focus on democratic processes. There is what I call long depression between 1920 and 1934 for farmers in the United States, particularly in those regions that export their crops abroad. This started in 1920. With Federal Reserve policy again. Prices crashed after the Federal Reserve raised interest rates and contracted the money supply, and farmer incomes never quite recovered. Now, you'll see in 1925, there's a little bit of an average moment, but something important to note is this is an average, and different crops are doing well different years. But for most of the 1920s, farmers assumed debt, and their foreclosure rates raised throughout this entire period. This accelerated during the Great Depression, and I use this as kind of a light evidence. If you look here, these are the Federal Reserve districts in the left-hand graph. St. Louis and Cleveland were two of the more orthodox banking Federal Reserve districts that had very tight monetary policies. And if you look down to the 1930 midterm elections, most of the dark blue, those are districts that are switching their House of Representative votes and putting in electing Democrats into the majority, come from those two districts. So there seems a light relationship, at least, between Democratic responses to the consequences of tight monetary policy early in the Great Depression. So this brings us to who is Joseph Taylor Robinson. He's often described by later scholars, particularly those sympathetic to the Brain Trust, as overtly conservative because of his frustrations with many of the Brain Trust. But I think that overlooks that the real difference between the two of them is that the Brain Trust were largely planners and Robinson is more markets. But if you look at Robinson's entire career, he was a progressive Wilsonian. He was an ally of Wilson during the 1910s. Throughout the 1920s, he launches a fight with Klan-backed senators and conservative senators from the Deep South for control of the Senate caucus, which he wins. He's the VP nominee for Al Smith in 1928 after a particularly vicious fight against a Klan-backed Alabama senator in the Senate floor. This is not someone that, if you look at the entirety of his career, comes off as a reactionary or Deep South senator. More importantly, for my point, is that Robinson has a very personal relationship with this long depression. He was a junior member on the Joint Inquiry on Agriculture, which studied the degree to which the Federal Reserve created the farm crisis in the aftermath of World War I. And Arkansas particularly suffered heavily throughout the 20s. The 1927 Mississippi flood wiped out half the state's roads. The state had issued several municipal bonds that were to be funded by those roads, and when they were washed away, that revenue dried up, creating a fiscal crisis within the state. In 1930, the collapse of Caldwell and Company, the largest bank in the South, rippled throughout the South, creating a financial crisis. It's one of the first major banks to fall during the Depression, and it particularly took down a bank called Arkansas Exchange and Trust. Arkansas Exchange and Trust was led by the banker A.B. Banks, a fitting last name. Banks was Robinson's brother-in-law. In the aftermath of the foreclosures, an aggressive attorney general seeking to make a name for himself decided to charge A.B. Banks with conspiracy to commit fraud for accepting deposits with his bank insolvent. Robinson organized a defense for his brother-in-law. That case lost in Little Rock. A governor's pardon for Banks is what released him. And by 1933, Arkansas defaults. Why I show this is Robinson has a deeply personal experience with the limitations of the monetary policy. Particularly, one of the things that underscored the failure of A.B. Banks as banks in Arkansas was that the St. Louis Federal Reserve System, when its assets became frozen, refused to make additional loans. It said its money was tied up in Caldwell. That was its own problem. If it goes defunct, and St. Louis Federal Reserve let it go defunct. As a midst of the A.B. Banks trial, though, it would bring Robinson into contact with someone that will come later. But I mentioned Robinson's experience because something important to know is that there are three different strands of monetary thought prior to Roosevelt's arrival in D.C. And these three are actively engaging and debating with one another. There's the Sound Money Caucus, in a way, which is basically advocates of the gold standard. Their foremost economic advocate is a guy by the name of Benjamin M. Anderson. He's Chase National Bank's chief economist, and he has a very Austrian perspective of economics. In the Senate, he was supported by Senator Carter Glass, the Democrat of Virginia, and one of the two authors of the Federal Reserve System. In contrast, the honest money faction inside the Democratic Senate was inflationist. They believed that the farm decline in prices was driven by monetary policy, and an aggressive expansion of currency was required to reset this. It was led by former Senator Robert Owen, the other namesake of the Federal Reserve Act, and Owen had aggressively criticized the Federal Reserve as failing to live up to the promises with which he had created it. He, after retiring from the Senate, was followed by Senator Elmer Thomas of Oklahoma, who'd become the chief leading inflationist in Congress. And then finally, there was the stable money movement that sought to balance these two. Inspired by the work of Irving Fisher and John R. Commons, it increasingly articulated the view that the United States hoarding of global gold and refusal to allow it to flow freely to allow European demand to resume had destabilized agriculture, and what was necessary was to reflate the dollar in some form or another through either commissions, through a revaluation of the dollar. But this stable money policy had built a strong coalition between farmers and economists, bridging a gap and divide in economic thought, where the majority of economic orthodox thinkers believed the agriculture crisis was solely due to overproduction. This brings us to a gentleman by the name of James Fairfax Loughborough. Loughborough is a lawyer from a powerful Little Rock firm by the name of Rose Hemingway, Loughborough, and Cantrell. If one of those names sounds familiar, yes, that is the Rose law firm of Clinton infamy. That's how old that law firm is. That's how influential that law firm is. Loughborough was one of the partners there. He was the architect of Arkansas's bond issuances, its municipal and state bonds, and this was a job he had inherited from his father, who oversaw the reformation of Arkansas's Reconstruction bonds. Loughborough assists Robinson in the defense of the A.B. Banks case, and when he gave Robinson the news of the outcome of the case, Loughborough begins a dialogue with Robinson about, is the United States considering gold revaluation in February of 1932? To be clear, Roosevelt is not even the nominee yet. And Loughborough begins writing that he's concerned that there are bills circulating that we may create independent boards that are going to take over this power to determine the U.S.'s money from Congress, rather than Congress exercise its rights. This begins a dialogue between Robinson and Loughborough, where Loughborough increasingly advocates and pushes for a form of revaluation to Robinson. And one of the central issues that comes up is this issue of what's called the gold clause. Every contract in the United States was written that you could redeem it for dollars or you could demand it for the gold equivalent. What this meant was that in the event of a revaluation or loss of dollars, you could turn around and demand that someone pay you in gold for that contract. This created a serious problem if the US wanted to revalue. Robinson also had another friend whose name was Charles Simonton McCain. McCain was also from Little Rock. He was a banker, and he happened to be chairman of Chase National Bank. This starts a dialogue between Chase National Bank, who Benjamin Armstrong is writing their economic thought for, versus Loughborough over whether or not the United States can revalue well before the election day in 1933. And what Simonton McCain argues is that ultimately, if the United States were to revalue the dollar, it would run into several problems. One, it would be dishonorable. Two, it would lose faith and confidence in the United States. Sorry, how am I doing on time?
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. It would lose faith and confidence in the United States. And ultimately, that it would be unfeasible because all what would happen is if you announced revaluation, banks would respond to that revaluation. Loughborough responds that actually we shouldn't think of it this way. If Congress exercises the powers that's given to it by the Constitution, and a private contract cannot take those powers from Congress, then how could it be dishonorable for Congress to execute its powers? He then proceeds to go, what we can do if we're worried about speculation is we can preempt this by subtly transferring Congress's powers to the presidency. And the president can then use executive orders. And finally, there's discussions of tariffs because, of course, all are anti-tariffs at the time. But what I want you to see here is that in executing a monetary strategy, the U.S.'s eventual road to revaluation follows very closely to the script written by Loughborough. Robinson takes the memo written by Loughborough, he circulates it around the U.S. Senate. This gentleman by the name of Senator Tom Connally takes up that mantle. In January, he's proposing the United States should revalue the dollar. In order to get around fears of speculation, the Thomas Amendment is included in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. That Thomas Amendment basically bundles multiple inflation policies together and gives them to the president as powers. And part of the reason why is this obfuscates the degree to which you can move, which power the president may use. And then from there, for the rest of the year, Congress began an active agitation campaign to put pressure on Roosevelt to accept the need for revaluation. And ultimately, this culminates in February of 1934, the United States signing the Gold Reserve Act, giving Roosevelt the power to revalue, and the next day, Roosevelt revalues the dollar from $20.67 an ounce to $35 an ounce. This is believed ultimately to start to begin to revive agriculture prices. And I want to go very quickly, because at the current moment, you may be like, what does this have to do with civic government? First off, was the Gold Reserve Act good policy? In many ways, it helped revive agriculture prices. There's studies that seem to suggest that the recovery in farm is the beginning of the recovery from the Depression period. It was executed in a way to prevent the things that would counteract its consequences. But more importantly for us, I think there's a practical consideration here of expertise versus democracy. I mentioned Walter Lippmann up front because Walter Lippmann famously advocates that because we don't have enough information, we need to have technocrats, experts who can govern over us. But in contrast, by 45, Friedrich Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society argues that because we don't know all economic knowledge, because it's shared across all of us, markets can be more effectively answer this. But the reality is, though, we have collective action problems. We have problems that it needs all of us to be on, that the government can solve and overcome. And what I want to suggest here is that if we think of the New Deal's successes, not the New Deal in its entirety, but the New Deal's successes as a triumph not of executive expertise, but of representative government, it makes us consider and focus and emphasize on the need to rejuvenate representative institutions rather than demand further white knight solutions. Thank you.
Technology.
Sorry for that. Oh, sorry, Jake.
No worries. Okay. Let's see here. All right. So first and foremost, I just want to say thank you to the Chase Center faculty and staff, especially Christopher Green, Heather Morris, and all the staff who are feeding us and keeping us mic'd up throughout the conference. So today I want to talk to you about how I think, and with you, about historians of technology, and I think what they can contribute to the literature and teaching on civic life. And I want to do so by transporting us back into the bowels of mid-20th century American technology, into the wires that made up the American Telegraph and Telephone Company, AT&T, which at the time was the country's monopoly on telephony and the largest corporation in the world. And I'll do this by drawing on a forthcoming article in Modern American History and a more nascent piece on technology and civic life in American history. But first, I want to say a brief thing about technological determinism. Since the telegraphs and steam engines of the 19th century seem to annihilate time and space in this country, bringing us closer together, our countrymen and women have grappled with this idea, technological determinism. The notion that changes induced by scientific discoveries or technological breakthroughs are perhaps more important drivers of human affairs than humans themselves. American thinkers have grappled with this from Henry Adams and the anti-moderns all the way through, as we mentioned yesterday, to the post-World War II period, where folks like Vannevar Bush proselytized about an ever-expanding scientific frontier. In the 1970s, technological determinism was everywhere in American intellectual life and culture. It took both dystopian and utopian turns. The blackout of nuclear war loomed large, but so did the promise of energy abundance, seen across, I think, in the sort of glittering radiance from French reactors. Electronic media and cybernetics seemed to stoke fears about a totalitarian mass society. But it also kindled hopes that mankind might one day unite in a sort of global village. Enter into this scene historian Daniel Boorstin, who sought to claim technology and technological politics as a sort of chaotic good in American life, what he called the Republic of Technology. For Boorstin, the technological change was often spontaneous, but it created a dynamic and vital center in America that could propel different factions in our politics to converge, just as broadcasting in the early 1900s, for example, helped transform small towns, hollers over into larger regional communities. On the left and right today, I think we're seeing broadly attempts to re-articulate a republic of technology for the 21st century. You see this in various Lord of the Rings themed companies like Palantir attempting to inject what they perceive to be civic virtues and national pride into technology, often with reference to AT&T, as we'll talk about in a second. And then on the sort of tech-optimistic left, you see writers like Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson again harken back to the moment of AT&T's prominence by talking about this as a sort of model of technological development that we should recreate for an abundant economic and political future of the 21st century. But as a Boorstin, I think at the time, might be instructive for how we might situate people like Alexander Karp, Ezra Klein, and Derek Thompson today. So at the time, Borstein's fiercest critics accused his intellectual synthesis of creating a cult of consensus, in the famous phrase by historian John Hyam. That was a sort of smoke and mirrors show that masked the fiercest debates about technology in American politics and papered over the different factions at work trying to claim those politics for themselves. I think we might carry that critique forward to some of the left and right attempts to talk about a republic of technology today. And so now I want to get to, I think, where historians can enter this. And so as a historian and teacher invested in understanding how technology shapes civic life, but also how civic life shapes technology, I think that we should be wary of new cults of consensus cropping up about technological change today. And I think history instructs us instead, drawing on great work like Merritt Rose Smith or David Noble or other historians of technology writing in this period, that we should expect fierce civic disputes wherever and whenever new technologies or technological infrastructures emerge in society. And as I'll show momentarily, drawing on hackers of the 1970s and 80s who exploited AT&T's wires, technology is always shaped by power and politics. The choices we make in our civic life, riffing on what Jenna Story said yesterday, what we should do together. And I think a nice quote that sums this up comes from David Noble's book, that really paying attention to the politics of technology allows us to see that, quote, realm of freedom within technological development known as politics. So to sum up, I've talked about some of the ways that factions in American life have claimed the politics of technology in the 70s and now. We can talk more about the abundance and tech right factions later on too. I've gestured to, I think, how historians see technological change as reshaping society, but it's never deterministic. Civic life is always conditioning how technology is received. And so now we're going to talk about AT&T and hackers as one of these surprise stories of technology being put to very, very different ends than AT&T's executives might have thought. So with that, let me turn to AT&T, otherwise known as the Bell system. I'll refer to these to AT&T interchangeably in this period. And what you need to know right off the top is that AT&T, the Bell system, comprises multiple different components. AT&T is an umbrella organization which includes Bell Labs, a research and development division, which is responsible for many things like satellite communications, transistors, Western Electric, a manufacturing arm, and then dozens of regional operating committees, corporations. And together, in the time that the tech right and tech left are looking back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, AT&T had emerged in American life as the symbol of technological progress and the example of the American corporation. In 1960, in fact, AT&T was the world's largest corporation. It employed over 1 million people, only surpassed in federal employment levels by the federal government. Its assets totaled over $114 billion, more than General Motors, Ford, General Electric, Chrysler, and IBM combined. And having emerged from a fierce moment of American politics in the early 1900s, it was kind of the representative example of public utility liberalism. And from the statue on the left here, commissioned by an early corporate executive, Theodore N. Vail, you can see how Americans and AT&T executives alike saw AT&T as channeling Promethean energies, harnessing electricity and wire. And as you can see in the sort of later advertisement for Western Electric, the manufacturing wing of the Bell system, people believed that AT&T was actually manufacturing the future, creating the technologies for tomorrow. And they were not entirely wrong. AT&T, as Americans fanned out in society, spread, drawing on benefits from the GI Bill, into suburbs and other places, the volume of telephone calls ballooned. So much so that the armies of telephone operators, mostly women until that time, hundreds of thousands in the post-war period, they could no longer keep up with the volume of traffic. And so AT&T's engineers switched to electronic or automatic dialing in these square city block sized rows of basically filing cabinets, which would route based on electronic pulses conveyed through the various telephones at the time, rotary dials, would route calls to their destination. And as AT&T started to develop this infrastructure and deploy it across the country, a monopoly at the peak of its power, of course, they wanted to brag about the technology. They did so in advertisements. They did so in newspapers and in technical journals like the Bell System Technical Journal, where they explicitly described the process by which the new control tones for the electronic switching system spreading across the United States could be used. And engineers were very excited about this. They had a lot of civic pride, let's say, about the American telephones that were being developed at the time. But as this information spread across America, Bell System technical journals arrived in libraries, on university campuses, and interested tinkerers, hobbyists, and eventually what we would call computer hackers, otherwise known as phone freaks, P-H-R-E-K, a phonetic play on phone and freak, of course. They got a hold of this information too, and they started devising technologies and techniques to exploit the system. Now, Ron Rosenbaum, a columnist at Esquire in 1972, by this point, AT&T's switching system had been deployed across the vast majority of America's trunk lines, the big hubs of telephone traffic. He writes a profile, Secrets of the Little Blue Box, surveying the tens of thousands, he claims at the time, of business executives, college students, and yes, computer and telephone hackers who are using this device, the Blue Box, a multi-frequency manipulator, to basically make free telephone calls. Now, many people of interest were using this. Some notable, maybe to folks in this room, include Steve Wozniak, who with Steve Jobs got his start in the business of selling technology by building and selling these devices in his college dorm at Berkeley's campus. And with each box he sold, they would include a slip saying, "You have the world in your hands." But just as, aspiring technologists and American entrepreneurs like Wozniak got involved with this, so did notable activists and probably new left provocateurs, you might say, of the 1960s and 70s. And no other than Abbie Hoffman got involved. Hoffman, kind of known for, I think in many ways, creating the media-savvy stunt and gimmickry that I think is still with us in our politics today, had written a best-selling manifesto for American activists, Steal This Book. It had sold about 500,000 copies. He's famous for other stunts like nominating a pig to run at the Democratic National Convention meeting in the late 60s. And when he gets a hold of this piece by Ron Rosenbaum, and this is one of my favorite finds from his archives, he scrawls across the top of the article, "We must have this device in our revolutionary arsenal." And so Hoffman and others within the broad countercultural and new left movements of the 60s and 70s, far from the people Bell intended to be using their new technology, they got to work starting to create in journals like the Youth International Party Line, to create basically a paper workbench where various activists or provocateurs in modern American politics synthesized the sort of free love countercultural ethos of the 60s and 70s with issue-by-issue improvements on the technologies and hacks that would allow them to exploit and get better at exploiting the Bell system. But this was not just a synthesis of the counterculture and the technoculture. It, in part, was sexy to these people because AT&T represented to Americans, not just on the new left, but increasingly in the 60s and 70s, and this ultimately leads in the resurgence of anti-monopoly politics and AT&T's breakup in the early 80s, Americans began to turn against AT&T. Americans looked to the war on Vietnam and pointed out that a 10% excise tax on telephone calls was channeling many millions of dollars to support the war effort, let alone Western Electric manufactured war technologies, which many folks in different sectors of American life took issue with. AT&T, again, the largest employer in this period, was subject to a ton of different labor actions in the 60s and 70s. Women protesting that they weren't being promoted in the right way. They were always being slotted into low-rung operator jobs. Desegregation lawsuits, which lead to the largest strike of the 1970s, 500,000 communication workers of America, members walking out from their AT&T employers. Of course, the dawn of worries about surveillance capitalism in the 1970s and 60s. the easy relationship FBI agents had with AT&T phone operators. This caused people in the American underground press to talk about Big Mother, AT&T or Ma Bell, as it was called. Big Mother is listening. And of course, this led people to say that the telephone was no longer a symbol of American technological progress, but a beast to be tamed by phone freaks, labor activists, and eventually antitrust regulation. And of course, this is less, I think, particular than all of these things, but Bell, once the sort of American corporation, became increasingly seen as the place where the man in the gray flannel suit lived. And you can see this in a sort of essay from the mid-70s from somebody who worked at one of the Bell operating companies, talking about the Ma Bell mold pressing ever more tightly around the operator in this case. And this wasn't a critique people made just of AT&T. IBM is famous for coming under similar fire in this period. And even after AT&T was broken up, split into many of the telecommunications companies we still live with today, this legacy of what becomes called hacktivism lives on and is transmuted into the culture of computer hackers, which still lives with us today. And in the 80s, people look back to this moment where weirdos and people we might find objectionable, like Abbie Hoffman, interpreted new technologies as tools of politics, tools, as he would describe them, of resistance or whatnot in American civic life. And they valorize him as a role model. This is in the late 1980s. And people now firmly in the personal computer culture of the 80s talk about Hoffman as somebody who stood up to the ultimate computer system known as society. And this set of ideas goes on even to inspire hackers who we live with today. They work in the NSA. They are the CEOs of corporations. This is part of my larger dissertation project. Hackers are central features of American politics today. But this very idea of hackers having a political relationship with technology, using technology for political ends, leads them to testify before Congress in the 1990s, where Senator John Glenn even says to the long-haired hacker seated in the middle here, "Young man, you might want to run for office someday." And so I bring up this history in part because it's the part of the history of technology I know the best, but I think in part because I think it's instructive of the way that civic struggle is always embedded in technological change. And I think drawing on great scholars like Shannon Valor, who are writing in this space of civic thought, coming from PPE, I think we can hook up with these intellectual projects as historians and say, look, technological change is ever present, never deterministic. Surprises, like the surprises hackers furnish us with, come about at every turn. But that in the process of looking at these examples in our history, in the technological republic, I think, we can gesture at, through example, some of the techno-moral virtues which we want our students to cultivate through cross-listings, I think, in PPE classes and in a deep training in the liberal arts. And we want them to carry forward today. So with that, I'll stop, and we'll go, I think, to questions.
Okay, we have 11 minutes. Oh. Yes. Clapping. Okay. Question.
That was a brilliant paper and a brilliant panel. Thank you so much. This question just comes out of my training as a literary critic. I often thought of hackers as associated with, 1980s cyberpunk literature, very internet age, and you have just added a whole new framework to think that through. So I guess I would just invite you, if you'd like, I suspect that there's a connection to AI in there somewhere. So do you think that your study of the long structure of hacker culture and its relationship with large technological companies evolving through AT&T and then the computer age and now something new, is this, do you find, and feel free to say this is too presentist for me, but I would like you to invite, if it is not too presentist, do you find that artificial intelligence can be contextualized in this way? In the same way that the computer is, can we extend that even further into the present?
I think so. It's somewhat out of scope from the book project, although I think I end with I probably might end the book project with the 7th annual Congressional Hackathon, which took place last week and was all about civic hackers. We gathered, I went, this is in Washington, D.C., in the basement of the Capitol Hill Visitor Center, and it was all about using technological expertise to try to leverage AI into congressional processes, which to me is in the larger manuscript, I think, symptomatic of the way that hacking, which emerges as this type of critique of American technology, is integrated into like one of the component parts of American political order today. I think there are very interesting people doing longue durée histories of artificial intelligence. Matthew Jones at Princeton is one of them. And I think looking at how researchers have debated the politics of AI going back before the long AI winter to the 1950s, and talking iteratively about how cohorts of researchers have talked about ethical questions, to go back to the last panel, you can come to similar you can take a similar methodological approach, and I think, and arrive in a pretty similar way. Like artificial intelligence, since that idea was introduced in the 1950s, has been extremely controversial. People have, despite employees eschewing ethical considerations sometimes, many of the researchers have fiercely debated this, and the version of the story presented to us by the likes of Sam Altman is often a very, let's say, narrow version of the story. So we should talk more about what you described as your own interest in the 80s, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And I was just reflecting on the last panel in light of this one, and you made a joke at the beginning that though I wanted to say I want to commend both of you. You gave concrete historical studies, and then which clearly were framed by questions that have a civic dimension, and you weren't embarrassed to do that, and it was informative. So that seemed to me good examples of solid historical research that meets that. So forgive me for if my question's a little vague. Jacob, in the end, you had a slide about how this connects to civic education. You had quotes from Shannon Valor, I think, about how liberal education can inform the kind of questioning about technology. Again, this is too vague, but I was wondering if you could expand a little more concretely on what those connections could possibly be. Yeah. And I wonder if a version of the question is like, how did you come to this research and your broader interest that came to this project, if that was informed by your experience with liberal education, anything like that. But anybody can say anything at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think a large portion of the reason I came to this project is because I think we're living in a moment, and this is partly what's laudable about the tech right and tech left's attempts to rearticulate a politics of, I think, techno-optimism. We're living in a moment that is so, in a variety of ways, technologically deterministic again. You have technologies are only tools of corporations who are turning you into ones and zeros and want to manipulate your life. And then you have that's kind of like Shoshana Zuboff surveillance capitalism. And then you have Mark Andreessen, and Peter Thiel to some extent. Technology is the only force to break us out of our sclerotic institutions. And there are parts of both of those things that are true, but I think I came to this as a way to scratch beneath that surface. To your point about liberal education, I mean, I think I'm trying to be more suggestive there than I am concrete, in the same way as some of our fellow historians attempting to gesture to the interdisciplinary conversations we might have in the spirit of civic thought are just taking place, and I think we're figuring it out. But to me, this is gesturing at what I think would be a very cool project of, say, co-teaching with a philosopher or a historian of political thought, right? Where you could vacillate between very particular moments or episodes in the history of technology, right? People worrying about the telephone forever erasing private life because of the incessant ringing in the domicile, all the way through AI concerns, and then kind of move back and forth with more philosophically inclined reading. So we should talk more about it, but I think it's aspirational, maybe more than it is concrete at the moment.
I knew Carolyn had something to say about inflation here.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'll ask a question about the first paper. So it seemed like you were focusing on, was it mostly the role of the president or of Congress in shaping what happened with the gold abrogation? You've probably already thought about this, but the courts played a very important role. This was a really shocking episode where Roosevelt had drafted a fireside chat that he kind of threatened that he would give if the court didn't rule his way with the gold abrogation. That drafted fireside chat actually, to one of the earlier panels today, Daniel Burns, about why we need theologians here, cited scripture like justifying kind of higher power arguments for why he wouldn't go along with the courts if they didn't go his way on the gold abrogation. So I was curious if you had more thoughts on that. And then there's also this Richardson and Troost paper. Do you know it? It splits the Mississippi is split between the Atlanta and St. Louis Fed districts, and the St. Louis side of the state followed the Real Bills Doctrine and had fewer banking failures. So you could do a similar natural experiment to see what it implied for congressional turnover. That would be an interesting exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. So first on the court aspect, yes, it's a fascinating thing. Sebastian Edwards' book, I think, is fantastic on it because just a little bit, the gold revaluation doesn't just revalue the dollar. The gold revaluation means the U.S. defaults on its debt. And Argentina, when they default, go back repeatedly to the U.S. and they're like, you did it first. Joseph T. Robinson is in the front row when the court announces their decision. And part of the memo Loughborough's writing is quite long. Part of Loughborough's memos is he aggressively goes, look at Hepburn v. Griswold, here's the technical legal argument, this should pass Supreme Court muster. And so one of the interesting things over 1932 is that these senators are going like, okay, if we're going to do this, how are we going to get past these constitutional questions? And then Roosevelt takes it a different tact, but the senators very much were, how can we ensure that we're constitutionally exercising our powers? And I think that's one of the things that distinguishes what I think were congressionally led measures like AA, to some extent, the Gold Reserve Act, versus NIRA, because Robinson emphatically doesn't like NIRA, and he doesn't think it'll hold up under the constitutional rulings. But on the Richardson and Troost, absolutely, that's one of the inspirations for kind of me focusing on that Arkansas gets particularly hit is they're also in the St. Louis district, and St. Louis is aggressively hard on whether or not they want to, what they'll consider real bills. Yeah, absolutely.